We've been seeing a lot of headlines like follow the numbers or according to statistics pretty often. And data literacy is not only important to understanding science, but it's important to being able to navigate in a world where you're being constantly bombarded with numbers and statistics. Our goal, though, is not to have you become a data scientist, though it is a job field that's really blowing up right now. Rather, our goal is to help you to be able to become data literate, to be able to work with numbers. Data literacy basically is the ability to read, work with, and analyze data in a meaningful way. This brain building broadcast is going to be a little different than the ones you've done before. You're basically going to process and analyze a data set with me in Google Sheets. I'm going to teach you to do two things. You're going to learn how to sort data, and you're also going to learn how to make a pivot table. A pivot table is a tool in a spreadsheet program that helps you summarize, calculate, and analyze data so it's easier for you to make comparisons or find patterns in the data. Pivot tables are especially useful when you're trying to work with a really large set of data. Now don't feel overwhelmed because I'm going to do this with you step by step. Be sure to pause the video whenever necessary and rewind if you need it. I'll even prompt you on when to answer questions in the brain building broadcast on Schoology. Okay, let's get started. So you need to open up two things. You need to open up the spreadsheet from this document, BBB Google Sheets data, and you need to open up the questions for BBB Google Sheets questions. So if I click this, I'll start a new attempt. Now I got my sheet up. So let's take a look at what the first question wants us to do. It says sort the data by class. How many students are in each class period in this data set? So in order to sort data, it will be helpful if I froze the first column, the first row. So if I click on row 1, see how it's highlighted in blue, I'm going to go to View and Freeze. And now I'm going to click on row 1. So now when I scroll up and down, row 1 doesn't move with it. That's going to be a useful thing later on. Okay, now I need to somehow sort the data by class period. Currently the data is sorted by student. That's why it goes in alphabetical order. So if I wanted to sort by class period, I can click on column D. There's this little down arrow. And when I click on it, I can tell it to sort A to Z. Now everything is sorted by class period instead of by the student. So using that, I can figure out and answer the question, sort the data by class, how many students are in each class period in this data set. Pause the video and go ahead and answer that question. The next thing that we're going to do is question 2. It says, continue to examine the data that is sorted by class period. Compare it to the column team. Which class periods does Mr. Bingaman not teach any science class? Select all that apply. So if I go back to my data, keeping in mind that we have periods 1 to 10 during the day and that Mr. Bingaman teaches on East, you need to look at this data set and figure out which class periods Mr. Bingaman does not teach during the day. Pause the video and go ahead and answer that question. Alright, the next thing that you're going to do with me is after you sort the data by boy or girl and team, which team has more girls in the data set? You could figure that out just by looking at this data, but it's really jumbled and it would be easier if we were to sort it. So the way that you would do two sorts is I want everything sorted by team, but I also want it sorted by whether the person is a boy or a girl once I've sorted it by team. So that requires something special. What I'm going to do is highlight and click on A1, press Shift, and then click E15. So all of my data is highlighted. Then I would go to Data and click Sort Range. So now I can sort by multiple things. You gotta check off Data has header row because now it's using that row 1 as my headers. And I'm going to be sorting by team. So I want the sheet to sort everything by team. And then after it sorts by team, I want it to sort by whether the person is a boy or a girl. And then you click Sort. Great. Now everything is sorted by team, east or west, and then after sorting by team, it sorts by whether it's a boy or a girl. So therefore, it's a lot easier for me to figure out and answer that question about which team has more girls in this data set. So go ahead and do that in your Google Sheet and then answer question number 3. All right, question 4 is about pivot tables. Remember that pivot tables take a bunch of data and quickly summarizes it for you and does calculations. So in order to do this, go back to your sheet, and we need to make a pivot table for every factor that might influence the test score. So the 3 factors that I have are boy or girl, team, or class period. So I'm going to make 3 pivot tables. To make a pivot table, you need to highlight all your data. So I'm going to highlight from A1 to E15. Then I'm going to go to Data and click on Pivot Table. And then when it gives you the option of a new sheet or an existing sheet, you should do a new sheet. So click Create. I'm going to rename the new sheet. So for this one pivot table, I'm going to compare boys versus girls and change the tab. Now I'm going to input my data. So I'm going to click on rows and I'm going to select boy or girl. After I select boy or girl, I'm going to click the value that I want to compare. I would like to compare the test scores. Now it's showing the value of the test scores, but it's actually showing it as the sum, and I actually want to compare the average test score. So I need to click on this menu, click average. And now it's showing me the average of boys compared to girls in this pivot table. Let's go on and make another pivot table. I'm going back to my original data. My next pivot table is going to be by team. So I go to Data, Pivot Table, and select New Sheet. I'm going to drag this sheet over and rename it. Instead of Pivot Table 2, I'm going to call it Team. And then I need to start selecting my values that I want to input. So I'm going to say the row, I want to compare team. And then I want to click on the values because I want to compare the scores. But now it's showing it as the sum, and I want to compare the averages. So if I click on the menu, I select average, and now it compares the averages by team. All right, one more pivot table. Click on the original data. I'm going to make a pivot table about class period. So I go to Data, Pivot Table, New Sheet, Create. I'm going to rename this one Class Period. And then I'm going to click on Rows, Class Period. So now it has all my class periods listed, and I want to compare the scores by class period. So I'm going to click under Values, Score. And it's showing the sum, but I actually want that to be the average. So I'm going to click Average. So now it shows the average score by class period. Now, based on the values in the pivot table, I can go ahead and answer question number 4. The next thing that we can do is actually turn the pivot table into a graph, and it's super easy. So all you would have to do is highlight the data that you want graphed. So if I want to make a graph for boys compared to girls, I would just highlight from A1 until B3. Then I'm going to go to Insert, Chart. And Google Sheets basically figures out like what kind of chart is best for the data. So here we go. Because my independent variable is a category, it's going to make a bar graph. So here is my graph comparing boys and girls. And now I'm going to make one for team. All right, so I will click my tab for team. I will click and highlight A1 to B3. Go to Insert, Chart, and here is my graph by team. Perfect. And I got one more graph to make. Notice that this one is also a bar graph because my independent variable is not a number, it's a category. By class period, it looks like my independent variable is a number, so I'm expecting a different type of graph. If I click A1 to B8 and go to Insert, Chart, it's going to guess the best chart to represent my data, which is a line graph. Now, this line graph is not really the best representation because it doesn't show the change very well. So let's make a couple of adjustments. All right, let's go to Customize. And I want to stretch out this data. So I'm going to go to the vertical axis and I'm going to select the minimum and maximum value. I know that on a test by percent, the maximum value is about 100. And I know that I don't have anybody scoring below a 70. So I'll make the minimum value a 70. Now I can actually see the changes a lot better on my graph. But I also would like to have all of the class periods showing up on the x-axis. So let's fix that as well. So I'm going to go to my horizontal axis. And I want to treat the labels as text. So I'm going to check off this box. And now I actually have all of my class periods listed on the x-axis. One other thing that might make this graph a little bit more readable is the grid lines. I like some more grid lines. So let's see, I have the major grid lines, but I'm going to check off I would like to show the minor grid lines. So it's a little bit easier to read the graph. Perfect. Now, based on the 3 graphs that you have made, you should be able to go ahead and answer question number 5 and question number 6. All right, well, let's take a look at question number 7. It says, what can you conclude with certainty from the pivot table comparing the scores of boys versus girls? So when you actually look at the pivot table, it says that the girls scored 89% on average and the boys scored 84% on average. Most likely you would jump to the idea that, oh, girls are smarter than boys because they scored higher on this test. However, when it comes to real data science, just because one number is bigger than another doesn't mean that there's actually any significant difference between those numbers. Which brings up the next question of, well, how much higher would girls have to score than boys for us to say there is a significant difference, that we can maybe make some conclusion about girls being smarter than boys on this test? Well, the reality is, with 7th grade math, you can't figure that out. Rather, you would have to do some kind of data science by doing calculating what you might call a p-value or a confidence interval that tells you where the cutoff is for how much higher girls would have to score than boys for us to call it significant. But based on the data that we have right here, we don't have any evidence to conclusively really say that girls did better than boys. All right, if we take a look at question number 8, it asks what seems to affect the test scores the most based on the pivot tables comparing test scores to boy versus girl, team, and class period. So we're just looking to see which one of these factors seems to have the greatest effect. We're not going to say necessarily conclusively which one does, but of the 3, which seems to matter the most. Question number 9 asks, based on the pivot table for class period, which of the following observations is true of the class period and average test scores? Again, an observation is just like what we see in the data, not really drawing any definitive conclusions about why, but just what we notice, or any type of pattern. I hope that was a little bit helpful to you. Remember that on question 10, you are supposed to submit the actual spreadsheet that you modified in Schoology. And it's my hope that you are feeling a little bit more comfortable with Google Sheets and sorting data and pivot tables and graphing. Remember that this video is always going to be here if you need to go back and reference it. I think that you did a great job.